we talked earlier about how knowledge is that which replicates itself in the environment or tends to get replicated in the environment, not necessarily replicates itself,
Yeah.
although it does in evolution, but it tends to get replicated in the environment. So if you were able to peek across the multiverse, you would see that error correction leads to the same or similar knowledge across the multiverse.
Yeah.
Is that true within a given universe as well? Because the universe is fairly large. There should be error correction processes. Maybe they're going on elsewhere.
We know that there's such a thing as convergent evolution, that things look like tigers, but they evolved in Australia or whatever. And we know that there's a convergent evolution of ideas, because people can have an idea and a person who they've never heard of has the same idea, and that can happen as well. It's not as systematic as it is in the multiverse, because in the multiverse you get all variants of the same kind of size or involving the same number of mutations. They all happen, and they're all error corrected. So convergent evolution is a much stronger effect in the multiverse.
I see. But within a given universe, does that increase, it's not probability, but does it increase the idea that there's more life out there? Life itself being a convergent property of certain initial conditions
In the universe?
in the universe?
Yeah, maybe, but
Yeah.
we don't know.
We don't
We could be a fluke, or this could be a universe where there are very few people initially.
Mhm.
There might be a lot more later.
There's a lot of Kepler planets out there. What's your intuition?
I don't know.
Let's talk a little bit about anti-rational memes. I think this is one of the least understood parts of what you've written about. And it's mentioned briefly in the beginning of Infinity. And it's basically, I think this is the part where I understand the least, because I will admit I did not resonate with that chapter as well. But I think your thesis is that a lot of human progress was held back because the creativity went into figuring out how to keep people where on the ideas that
Yes.
certain people already said, these are the correct ideas, and we're going to stay here. And then all creativity got poured into reinforcing those ideas,
Yes.
as opposed to letting you wander outside of those boundaries.
Yes.
So what are these anti-rational memes? Are they still around? Is it
Yes.
always a war between them and the rational memes? And
Yes.
you know,
So first of all, that this happened, it seems to me unanswerable. There's no other way of explaining why it took 300,000 years at least to get from stone tools to the very first real progress.
Mhm.
It depends where you count it from starting, but certainly far less. It's very recent compared with 300,000 years. I think secondly, I think we shouldn't be surprised that anti-rational memes exist, because evolution, it's the most evolutionarily stabilized thing in a biological organism. It's the genetic code. Like, the biology doesn't care about your arm being chopped off, except insofar as that affects the propagation of your DNA. And the DNA, all evolution of stuff inside the cell that affects whether mutations are going to happen in the DNA, they're all towards greater fidelity. There are no mutations that reduce the fidelity. Some people, I used to think, and Dawkins has contradicted those people very cogently, that maybe there's an optimum amount of mutation, because if you have too much, then too many of you die too soon. And if you have too little, then you don't evolve fast enough to cope with changing circumstances. So there's an optimal amount, and maybe the error correcting mechanisms are not optimized for error correction, they're optimized for that. That's not true. The real truth is that species go extinct all the time for this very reason, that they have too strong error correction. Not enough evolution happens to cope with the fact that circumstances change. So the vast majority of species that have ever existed went extinct. And they went extinct because they did not evolve to meet the new conditions. And I think that's what we should expect from memes. It's a bit of a miracle. That's not like necessarily true of memes. And I could talk a bit about why it's not necessarily true. But the thing we should expect when we first encountered, the thing I expected when I first realized that there were going to be anti-rational memes, is that they were going to get more and more anti-rational. There's nothing to stop them. There's the fact that they're going to eventually kill the subculture that has them doesn't stop them any more than the peacock's tail sooner or later will result in the extinction of the peacock species, even though the male peacocks are still trying to get larger tails and the female peacocks are still selecting the larger tails and so on. All that's happening. And sooner or later, the species will go extinct, as almost all species have. So therefore, I also realized that the actual faculty of creativity couldn't have evolved in order to be creative. It must have evolved for some other reason. And then Popper comes in to save us when he points out that there's no such thing as instruction from without. There is in the case of DNA. In the case of DNA, we can just copy, like when the cell divides, it can just copy the existing DNA. There's no way of copying an existing culture into the next generation. The next generation has to guess. And most of the information that it builds up when it is trying to copy has been generated inside itself and is going to be different in lots of ways. So you don't need a strong mutation mechanism. Even so, it took a long time, and I don't think we know the history. Matt Ridley says you need a certain population size before progress can take hold. I'm not sure that's true. My counterexample is the earliest open societies, the earliest rational societies. Like, as far as we know, there may have been some before, but the earliest ones we know of, Athens, were very small by our standards, and they were even very small by the world's standards. I mean, Athens was a tiny proportion of the world's population, and yet it had this huge burst of creativity, which if it had gone on for 300 years like ours has, they might well have reached what we have reached. But it was destroyed for various reasons that historians try to understand and so on. Our enlightenment, having lasted, depends what you count, but lasted maybe 500 years, maybe 300 years. It's far longer than any previous enlightenment has lasted. All the ones that I've heard, and mainly the two I discuss in my book, lasted a generation or two, and then they ended. And I think they ended because they couldn't solve the problem that arose. They had what it took, but it was just too soon, and they were killed by the bad guys, winning by irrelevant things like force of numbers. And
What do you think are the dominant anti-rational memes in this version of the Enlightenment that could take us back to a dark ages? What do we need to stay in the Enlightenment?
Yeah, I can't think of a plausible way we could go back to the Dark Ages. I'm sure it's possible for fundamental reasons, but I can't really imagine it happening. And if I were to imagine it, it would be prophecy,
Mhm.
and I can't really imagine it. I think when you say anti-rational memes today, we've got to make a distinction between the West and everyone else. So everyone else has still got all the other cultures in the world are still dominated by anti-rational memes that embody their culture. That's the thing that's mostly the anti-rational memes are mostly devoted to protecting their existence and only secondarily other things. In the West, I think again, I don't know, but it seems to me that the subculture or the set of ideas in the West that is most anti-rational are the ones to do with education. Yes, why education? Maybe we should expect that because, like I said about biology, what are the most stable constructs in DNA? They are the code for ribosomes. The ribosomes are the educational institutions of cells. Their job is to pass on all the knowledge from one generation to the next. And they have to do that as faithfully as evolution can make it. And any evolution that occurs is in the direction of making them more faithful. They're still not perfectly faithful, but that's not evolution's fault. That's physics' fault. We've got too many cosmic rays coming down and too much ultraviolet light and so on. And it is thought, although again, I saw a YouTube video saying that maybe this isn't at all true, but biologists think that the ribosome stopped evolving, 2 billion years ago. Everything else has carried on evolving and the ribosome hasn't. The DNA code has remained the same, even though you could, and they have, invented a different DNA code and implemented an artificial ribosome, and it doesn't exist in nature. In a culture, traditionally, the thing that is responsible for maintaining the culture over generations, fighting the fact that people die and cultures want to stay the same, want to preserve their knowledge, are educational institutions. And of course, from that point of view, they have to be anti-rational, just like evolution is. So then the mystery is not why they're anti-rational, it's why everything else has become more and more rational in the West. And that is, I don't know, again, this is a matter for historians. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was going to write a book about the Enlightenment, and it hasn't materialized. I first heard her talking about this many years ago, and I don't know why she hasn't written it. She's the perfect person to write it.
In a sense, the explanation for why almost all species have ever gone extinct is because evolution has not occurred fast enough, if only it occurred faster. And when it comes to civilizations, the overwhelming majority of civilizations have gone extinct because the memetic evolution hasn't happened fast enough.
Exactly.
We are tending in the direction of a more dynamic society, but there are anti-rational memes here that still challenge us. And you just mentioned educational institutions as a source for propagating these kind of things, but also parenting is another one that
there's primarily it's the educational institutions themselves, which if you think of if you think of institutions as a thing in people's minds, their ideas, then they themselves are the most anti-rational memes in the West. But they also, as you say, quite rightly, they also serve as means of propagating other anti-rational memes. And some people think that they've been taken over by a mind virus, and now they are even more anti-rational than they evolved to be.
Yeah, I think to a point you made at the beginning of Infinity, these institutions are load-bearing. They carry a lot of knowledge, but because they have heads and tails, they can be taken over. And a sufficiently compelling idea can come along, take over the whole thing, and then it's masquerading as the former institution, relying on the brand and the signaling value of the previous institution, but it's doing completely different things.
Scary, but plausible.
Yeah, there's a very cynical phrase that goes around the internet. It's someone's law or something like that, which is like any institution's behavior is best explained as if it's run by a cabal of its enemies.
You've got to be careful. I always apply the criterion of, if that's true, how do you explain the progress we've had?
Right.
There can't be a law to that effect. There can't be
There's no law.
law of Moloch or that thing.
But maybe it's as simple as individuals or small groups of individuals coming up with creative solutions. For whatever reason, there was a space and time where they had enough time to experiment with those solutions to see what was real. You can come with the theory of thermodynamics. Then you have a steam engine. The steam engine is actually turning wheels and pulling things. It works. And then you carve out a space in technology and science where these things are accepted, and then it expands out from there. And now we may be undergoing the opposite collapse, where technology and science are affecting so much life so quickly that people feel destabilized and left behind. So they rebel and they say, we have to regulate this and control that. And eventually now with AI regulations, we're talking about limiting the free exercise of mathematics. You can't have that many flops. You can't run that operation. You can't do that calculation even. So it might be just the genes or the memes that resist the change, they're being forced to change too fast. And so now they get the numbers on their side.
Yeah, I can't possibly accept the pessimistic version of that, but something like that is obviously true. But it's a problem. It's a problem that is soluble, and it's up to us to make the arguments.
What's underpinning the whole thing? Is it error correct? What is underpinning any solutions? Is it optimism? Is it error correction? Is it freedom of speech? Is it small groups? What is it? What's the counter? What's the antidote?
I could say freedom of speech is the thing that needs to be protected at all costs, but I don't think it's true that freedom of speech is being that much impaired at the moment. Certain things you're not allowed to say. So it's more that, and certain things you must say, which is perhaps even worse. But they are, I would call those fads, shibboleths, rather than actual reduction of the freedom of speech. I don't know if you like this analogy, but in medieval times there were guilds, and if you wanted to make anything, to join a guild, and therefore there was only one way of making a thing, and there was no scope for inventing a different way of making the thing, because you'd have to join a guild and they wouldn't let you. Now, that is the kind of thing we do not have at the moment in regard to freedom of speech. It's not that anybody that wants to say anything has to get permission. It's that anyone who says things in public has to obey certain constraints. But they are, like, the language is still universal, even if you obey those constraints. If the things you had to say became a substantial proportion of everything that everyone says, then if you had to say Comrade Stalin at the beginning of every maths paper, even then it didn't completely stop Soviet mathematicians from pursuing maths. And we're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near having to make a woke declaration at the beginning of every paper.
Do you have your pronouns in your bio?
That would be, so that's the thing that isn't happening yet. That would be the beginning of the...
I think culturally, though, slippery slope is a real thing, because it's the nature of politics. You get a little bit, it's a tug of war, you tug more.
If it were a real thing,
yeah.
then we wouldn't have ever had any progress, because in the past, the anti-rational memes were worse, much worse. And yet the Enlightenment happened. The Enlightenment happened. The Enlightenment was created by people who were thoroughly constrained by anti-rational memes. They had to, everything they said had to be praising God or praising the king, and they weren't allowed to, women weren't allowed, a whole bunch of things weren't allowed, and a bunch of other things were compulsory. But nevertheless, a small number of people, the elites, among the elites, the Medici were so powerful that they could violate some of the restrictions, and it grew from there.
Elon Musk today.
Yeah. Yeah. And you. Yeah.